for the people away.
Now when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around him, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders, and they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash. And there are also many other traditions that they observe, the washing of cups and pots and bronze kettles and beds. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" He said to them, "Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition.'" And then we have a contemporary word, which is from the Mill Valley Record, the publication, the newspaper that Linda used to, no, she was Pacific Sun. Yeah. September 27th, 1924. So, my mother, by the way, was born September 26th, 1927. So this is getting real close. The idea of organizing a community church in Mill Valley has existed for some 4 to 5 years from various quarters not connected with each other. The desire has been expressed from time to time that such an organization might come into being. This idea has seemed to be partly a contagion that has come from other communities where successful community churches are already in existence. The plan has grown very gradually in Mill Valley and has finally converged into action. For a month or 6 weeks past, interested people have been meeting in committee to discuss the purposes and advantages of a community church. The men and women who have met have been very largely those who have no church membership in Mill Valley, and yet are interested in the essential purposes for which the church stands. With so much that is traditional in existing denominations, it is felt that the differences that have grown up through many generations have become a hindrance and an unnecessary limitation, particularly since they are generally acknowledged to be non-essential. The movement for a community church in Mill Valley is in every respect kindly and constructive. It is not the intent to destroy anything, but rather to open an opportunity for new and broad construction for those who are already in sympathy with one another in the opinion that much can be accomplished for the community and the home. In merging denominational differences into one common purpose for a higher life and the teaching of spiritual truth in accordance with the vision and scholarship of the present generation. Man, they really went in for long sentences back in 1927. Anyway, there ends the contemporary reading. So,
well, I suspect that you, like me, are aware of a debate coming up this week. And so I thought that showing one of Jesus' debates with the Pharisees would be a good option for the morning. That's enough about our immediate political moment. And now we will lean toward the text. So all the language that Greg was reading about the community church and its beginnings, I wanted to find out what was really going on with community churches, because there said 4 or 5 years people have been talking about it, for example. So I went back into the literature and found a few things. First off, in 1890, I found several academic articles that talked about movements since the 1830s and 40s that wanted to come together in one Protestant Christian denomination rather than be so divided, for some of the reasons that were implied here, like competition and merging resources and so on. But there were several different ways that people were talking about it. One was what they called union, which is that two churches would just merge together. And they could have their own denominations in that church, but they'd be one church together. And another one was, two churches or more would merge together and they would become one church. They would stop being that one stop being their separate denominations. And then the other one is federation, where churches would come together and they would keep their separate identities, but they would worship together. And then the third one that was coming along was this idea of community church. And this idea of community church had several different interpretations. I'm not going to go into the depth on those, but in essence, they were aiming toward what they called a non-creedal church. And they were aiming toward a church that could welcome everybody without making people feel like in the wrong place. And that's a little bit like what we still try to do here today. So we're in the tradition there. By the 1918 and 1919s, there was quite a discussion going on in publications like the Christian Century, which I suspect some people in Mill Valley, maybe at the Congregational Church or other Protestant churches around, would read. And that discussion talked about how a community church might work. And some were very pro, and some were saying it would never work. And some were saying the community church should become, all the churches should become community churches. And by 1948, there was an article in Christian Century about, 1940, it was called The Community Church, Dawn or Dusk. And that writer argued that the purpose of the community church was to really replace the denominations, and that that's not what had happened. In essence, there was a new denomination called the community church, although it wasn't organized like a denomination. But people were gathering together in order to build up churches where denominational identity wasn't so important. And back in 1918, 1919, people were saying, well, you know, when the soldiers come home, they've been fighting with everybody in the trenches. They aren't going to want to see denominations and Christians broken up this way and that way. And someone else said, well, I've been a chaplain in the trenches, and many of the fighters are not Christian, and those who have denominations will most likely go home and go back to their own denominations. So from someone who had been there, this was kind of like a pipe dream. But here we are in 1924, and the community church has been following these discussions, and people have been meeting and making friends, making connections. And finally, it's going to start. And there's a lot more details to that I don't even remember right now. So you'll have to come on September 29th to see the play where these things are better explained. But the reason that I think this is important is one of the things that happened with the community church movement was the idea that anything that is not essential to the faith, we don't have to bring it along. So we don't have to say creeds, for example. And that was the most prominently cited one. So that people who came from a church where they recited the Apostles' Creed could feel welcome in a church where could feel welcome, not because people said the Apostles' Creed, but because they were welcome. And people who never said the Apostles' Creed were not confronted with saying the Apostles' Creed. So there was a lot of theological discussion. Now, I don't know how much was all in the theologians' minds and how much of it was actually out in the community. Always a good question. One of the things they were saying in the 1890s, one of the reasons for this new mode of churches was because we have to find a way to incorporate the natural sciences and what they are learning in the structure of our belief. And that, too, was part of the origins of the community church. So it's interesting because in our passage today, we've got the Pharisees and the scribes. And the Pharisees and the scribes have come from Jerusalem, according to the text, have come from Jerusalem basically to spy on Jesus, to make sure that he's not doing anything that opposes the work of the temple in Jerusalem. And there's some problems with that because the temple no longer had any jurisdiction in Galilee, so they would have to kind of sneak in themselves and find their way to places where people were gathered. But the Pharisees had a practice, washing hands was one of them, but had many practices they called the traditions of the elders. And these were traditions that they said everyone should follow. Although they had begun as practices for the priests in the temple, they said everyone should do these. We've talked a little bit about this before, that in terms of actually following those practices, most people could not have done them. They don't have the amount of water it takes to do the kind of washing that they're talking about. For example, they don't even have all the implements that are talked about. So it's important to remember that, and to remember that when they talk about washing hands, it's not about getting hands clean the way we learned during COVID, 30 seconds and all that. No, it's purifying, spiritually purifying yourself. So the word that's translated defiled could also be translated common. So common or purified. And so they say, why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with common hands? And he said to them, Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites. Basically, that they honor God with their lips, but not with what they do. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition. And that is a piece, I think, of the argument that's going on in forming the community church, that we try to reveal again for ourselves what are the essential instructions that we receive in our tradition, and what are the practices that would possibly be interesting, but if they violate the primary commands, then no. And an example of that actually comes up later in this chapter, because he talks about korban, and korban is a practice of dedicating land or people to the temple. And if your land has been dedicated, that means that you have to contribute extra to the temple. And he says that people have been dedicating land to the temple, and then their income is so low they can't support their parents in their old age. That is, they cannot honor their father and mother. And honor your father and mother, support them in their old age, is one of the 10 commandments. And so he's saying, when you make a dedication to the temple, are you depriving yourself of the ability to follow the commandments? So that's why he's talking about abandoning the commandment of God. So I like to think about this, that that when we think about the community that we're growing here, the community, we added 8 members in June, and I have a feeling we're going to add a few more this fall. When we have added members, we feel the growing. We have new members on the board and new members stepping up to take care of things around worship and so on. So we're growing. And part of that is because we're seeking what are the fundamentals of our beliefs, our practices, what do we trust here? And for me, and I've said this before, the fundamental aspect of forming a church is the human relationships. It's the welcoming each other, accepting each other just as we are. It is learning to listen to each other even when we disagree. Learning to listen to each other when we have theological differences, yes, but political differences or social differences or philosophical differences or even scientific differences. And it is that coming together, that love your neighbor as yourself practice, which is, I think, the core of who we are and how we are growing. So I think it's a good thing for us to consider what are the human traditions we have here, and are they the basis of who we are, or are they traditions that we can let go of? So what do we need to hold on to? What do we want to hold on to? And what has become something that we don't use anymore or don't appreciate anymore? There's a lot of work to do there, and I'm not going to get into it today. But I wanted to mention that one of the words that comes up again and again in these discussions of the community churches and unity churches is the word reconciliation. And there's been a feeling in the churches of division, of enmity, of competition, of struggle between churches, and wanting to step away from that and to reconcile. And I think that that holds true for each of us in our relationships, that we can look and say, where in my life is there room for reconciliation? Is there room for truly accepting my neighbor, my cousin, my sibling, who is in a very different place, whether religiously or politically or economically or whatever? So, reconciliation. So this is kind of going to be the theme for the next few weeks, is I'm going to be looking back at some of the historic theological arguments that have been going on around community church. And I think it'll provide a kind of a basis for recognizing what happens in the founding of this church, which is both part of a tradition and its own unique situation. Now, do I have anything exhortatory to end with? Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. There we go. Amen. We'll have an anthem going to be of interest to us in the coming week as we watch debates. Notice Jesus' debate technique here. Notice Jesus' debate technique here. So the Pharisees say, why do your disciples eat with defiled hands? That's essentially the question that they ask. And the reason they should is because it's part of the tradition of the elders. But why do your disciples eat with defiled hands? And he doesn't answer the question. He doesn't answer the question. He says, Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites. As it is written, they honor me with their lips, but not with their actions. They teach human precepts as doctrines. So, and if you read through Jesus' debates with the scribes and Pharisees anywhere, you're going to see that it's a frequent technique he uses. He recognizes that the question that they ask is not the right question from his perspective, and he turns it around. So I think that's going to be an interesting thing to watch for this coming week. And in addition, to watch for when people do turn the question to their own purposes rather than answer the question, how are they doing it and why are they doing it and what do they use instead? Because one of the things that Jesus' argument here shows is that he knows the tradition. And so he's not just going off on a tangent. He is answering them kind of by going around and making a big circle. It's like I've been watching I think I mentioned this last week. I've been watching videos of sheep herding dogs. For some reason, it cheers me up these days to watch a dog go around, and they go all around the flock, and the flock just gathers in and runs to the gate. That's kind of what Jesus does. So,
I would call that an odd hominem attack, though.
Attack.
Odd hominem attack. He was attacking the questioner.
He attacked the questioner, but he attacked them not as their person, but on the basis of what they do.
Well, he called them all hypocrites.
Yes, but then he says why he's calling them hypocrites. It's because what they do. Yeah. Thank you, Dan. You always keep me on track. And thank you, everybody, for welcoming a sermon edition. And now, let's have our time of sharing. Dan has a hand up.